Good morning. I'm back here in the classroom, and I had some people ask how our fish are doing. So I thought before I started today, I would show you if you can see or not. But there's a couple of them swimming around right now. Let's see if I can make a move. Let's see. They kind of tend to. Oh, there was one that just flashed past. Tend to hide at the bottom. Let's see. Come on, guys. Come on. There they go. Swimming around there. Anyways, fish are doing well. They miss all of you, I'm sure. As you miss them. Our third chapter today is called A One-Woman Crime Wave, 1931. I think of all the chapters, this is probably my favorite. A Great Depression had swept over the nation, and we couldn't seem to throw it off. It was still hoovering over us, as people said, because the president was President Hoover, so it's like saying Obamacare, making fun of the president's name. It hadn't bottomed out yet, but it was heading that way. You could see hard times from the window of the Wabash Bluebird. The freight trains on the siding were loaded down with men trying to get from one part of the country to another, looking for work and something to eat. Mary Alice and I watched them as they stood in the open doors of the freight cars. They were walking along the right-of-way, too, with nothing in their hands. Then, when we got off the train at Grandma's, a new sign on the platform read, "Drifters keep moving. This means you. Signed, O.B. Dickerson, Sheriff." But at Grandma's house, it seemed to be business as usual. Mary Alice was still skittish about the old snaggle-tooth tomcat in the cob house. Grandma said if he worried her that much, she ought to use the chamber pot in place of the privy. Chamber pots were under all the beds, and they were handy at night, but Mary Alice wouldn't use hers during the day. She didn't want to climb the stairs just for that, and she didn't want to have to empty it any more than necessary, because obviously it doesn't flush just the pot, so you'd have to dump it out somewhere. Kind of gross. Being 9, Mary Alice decided to take charge. She carried a broom to the privy to swat the cat if it gave her any trouble. She was soon back at the first afternoon, dragging the broom. Her eyes were watering, and she was holding her nose. "Something died in the cob house," she said. "Nah," Grandma said. "It's cheese." "I don't want any," Mary Alice said. "It's not for you," Grandma said. Now that they mentioned it, I could smell something pretty powerful wafting into the kitchen, and I could see the old tomcat from here, stretched out in the yard. He was breathing hard and nowhere near the cob house. The cheese smelled bad enough to gas a cat, but it was no use asking what it was for. We were bound to find out. Grandma's house was the last one in town. Next to the row of glads was a woven wire fence, and on the other side of that was a cornfield. On the first nights, I'd always lie up in bed, listening to the husky whisper of the dry August corn in the fields. Then on the second night, I wouldn't hear anything. Kind of like when you come to Goodington, you hear the train at first, and then after a few nights, it just blends in. But this year came the sound of shuffling boots, and sometimes a voice. The Wabash tracks had cut the town into two along the other side of the road. The sheriff's deputies were out, carrying shotguns, moving the drifters along, so they didn't hang around town to beg for food. From my window, I watched the swaying lanterns, and ahead of them, the slumping figures of the drifters heading for the next town. It was kind of spooky and sad. But it was a short night. At 5 the next morning, Grandma was at the foot of the stairs, banging a spoon against the pan. When we got down to the kitchen, we found her in a pair of men's overalls stuffed into gum boots. She couldn't go outdoors in overalls, so she'd pulled a wash dress on over them, and her apron over that. Crowning it all was her gardening hat. She'd anchored it with a veil to keep the mosquitoes away, and tied it under her chins. She looked like a moving mountain. Mary Alice couldn't believe the overalls. Did you guys catch the simile there? She looked like a moving mountain. "Keeps the chiggers off," Grandma explained. "We're going fishing." I looked around for the rods and reels, at least some bamboo poles, but didn't see anything. "It's just one thing after another in town," Grandma declared. "We wasn't over Declaration Day, before it was the 4th of July, and then come the old settlers' picnic. You can't hardly get down the street for the crowds, and the dust never settles. I need me a day off and some peace and quiet." Do you think it's really that busy in this town? Probably not. She's come up with something. Fresh from the Chicago Loop, Mary Alice and I traded glances. We didn't linger over breakfast because of the smell. The cheese was on the back porch now in a gunny sack. It began to dawn on me that it was the kind of cheese catfish consider a delicacy. Grandma was ready to go, and when she was ready, you had better be. Let's get on the road, she said, taking a last look around the kitchen. Douse the fire and hide the axe and skillet. We blinked. Just a sayin', Grandma said. A country sayin'. I was a country girl, you know. We carried the gunny sack of cheese, or she carried the gunny sack of cheese herself, tied to the end of a tree limb, hitched up on her shoulder. I was in charge of the picnic hamper, and it took all I had to lift it. I looked inside. Half the hamper was home-canned fruit, tomatoes and pickled peaches. The other half was vegetables from her garden. Snap beans, 4 turnips, a cabbage. The only thing that looked like a picnic was a loaf of unsliced home-baked bread. But I didn't ask. Grandma saved herself a lot of bother by not being the kind of person you ask questions. We trooped out into the morning behind her. As soon as we left her yard, we were in the country, but I had the feeling it would be a long trip. The hamper weighed a ton, and I had no luck in getting Mary Alice to carry the other handle. We were well covered against the chiggers, and the day was already too hot. Mary Alice preferred skirts, but she had on her play suit with the long pants. Being 11, I was way too old for shorts anyway, so I had on my jeans. We marched behind Grandma, and it wasn't too bad, until the sun came up over the tassels of the corn. We ate the dust of the road for a mile or so. Of course, being a city boy, I didn't know what a mile was, but it felt like a mile. At a stand of timber, we veered across the pasture. Watch your step, Grandma said. Cow pies aplenty. We were making for Salt Creek, and pretty soon the trees along the creek began to show on the horizon. But they were like a mirage that keeps its distance. Finally, we came to a barbed wire fence with a sign on it. No trespassing whatsoever. No fishing, nothing. Private property of Piatt County Rod and Gun Club, signed O.B. Dickerson, Sheriff. Sure are a lot of signs around, aren't there? Lift that wire so I can skin under, Grandma said. Doesn't sound like she's listening to the signs. The lowest wire was pretty close to the ground, but Grandma was already flat on her back in the weeds. She'd pushed the cheese through. Now she began to work her shoulders to inch herself under. I pulled up on the wire to the best of my ability, but there wasn't much slack to it. The barbs snagged her hat, though they cleared her nose, but now came her bosom. Mary Alice stood by, sucking in her own small chest, hoping to help. The wire cut my hand, and I was stabbed 3 times by the barbs. But, like a miracle, Grandma shimmied under. Mary Alice followed with plenty of room, though she didn't like to get burrs in her hair. Being a boy, I climbed the wires and pivoted over on a fence post, on the heel of my wounded hand. I dragged the hamper through, and now we were in forbidden territory. I don't get the impression that Grandma really cares for rules much. She kind of does what she likes. It all looked overgrown and deserted to me, but Grandma, speaking low, said, "Hush up from here on and keep just behind me." She obviously knows. We were in trees and tall grass. As we sloped to the creek bottoms, the ground grew soggy underfoot. Dragonflies skated over the scum on the stagnant backwater. Grandma made her way along the willows, weeping into the water. When she pulled back a tangle of vines, we saw an old, worn-out, snub-nosed rowboat. It was pulled up and tied to a tree, and the oars were shipped in the wet bottom, beside a long pole and a steel hook at the end. "Work that rope loose," Grandma whispered to me. She pointed to Mary Alice to climb aboard, and she followed, reaching back to me for the hamper. The knot was easy, but pushing the boat out with Grandma in it wasn't. By the time the boat was afloat, I was up to my shoe tops in muddy water. I never thought for a minute that this was Grandma's boat, but she was one expert rower. She had the oars in the locks, and they pulled the water with hardly a ripple. She turned us and rowed along the bank under the low-hanging limbs. We were on our way somewhere, quiet as the morning. I was in the back of the boat, lolling, my mind drifting. Then I got the scare of my life. A low limb writhed and looped. I caught a quick glimpse of sliding scales and an evil eye, maybe a fang. Then an enormous snake dropped into the boat. Just missed Grandma's lap and fell hissing between her and me. The last thing I saw was this thing, thick as a tire, snapping into a coil. When I came to, we tied up to a sapling, and Grandma was crouched over me. She was applying a rag wet with creek water to my forehead. Mary Alice was behind her, looking round-eyed at me. "You fainted, Joey," she accused. "Boys don't faint. I passed out. And it was probably mostly the heat. Sunstroke, maybe." Then I remembered the snake and grabbed up my knees. "Never mind," Grandma said. "It's gone. It was harmless. Good size, but harmless. There's cottonmouths round here, though, so I'd keep my hands in the boat if I was you." "It was swell," Mary Alice said. "It was keen. You should have seen how Grandma grabbed it up by its tail and snapped it just once and broke its neck. It was all neck, if you asked me." Then she hauled off and flung it away into the water. Mary Alice went on relentlessly. "Grandma, some things with snakes you should have seen." How do you think Joey feels right now? If I were Joey, I'd probably be feeling pretty embarrassed, especially if my kid sister was more okay with snakes than I was. Okay, I muttered. Grandma stifled a rare smile. Why do you think she's smiling? I suspected she had no high opinion of the bravery of the male gender, and I hadn't done anything to change her mind. Why wasn't it Mary Alice who'd done the fainting? It bothered me off and on for years. We were underway again, me keeping a sharp eye on low-hanging limbs. I was recovering from everything but embarrassment, and Grandma was rowing out from the bank. Now she was putting up the oars and standing in the boat. It rocked dangerously, though she planted her big boots as wide as the sides allowed. She reached down for the long rod with the hook at the end. Glancing briefly into the brown water, she plunged the rod into the creek. It hit something, and she began to pull the rod back, hand over hand. She was weaving to keep her balance in the tipping boat. I wanted to hang on to the sides, but pictured a cottonmouth rearing up and sinking fangs into my hand. Something broke the surface of the creek, something on a chain Grandma had hooked. It was bigger than a picnic hamper, and it looked like an orange crate, streaming water, and inside, whipping tails and general writhing. I thought of cottonmouths and ducks, but they were catfish, mad as hornets, who'd been drawn by Grandma's terrible cheese. She heaved in the crate and unlatched the top. In the bottom of the boat was a wire net, and a contraption that expanded as she filled it with the wriggling fish. A catfish is the ugliest thing with gills, and even Mary Alice drew back her feet. Grandma kept at it, bent double in the boat. She was as busy as a bird dog, one of her own favorite sayings. It's a simile, another one, by the way. When all the catfish were in the net, flopping their last in the bottom of the boat, she took the new cheese out of the gunny sack and stuck it in the crate. "Grandma, how did you remember where it was?" I said, amazed. "You couldn't see it, but you snagged it with the hook right off." "Remembered where I'd sunk it," she said briefly. Now she was lowering the empty crate, bait with cheese, back into the water. Except it wasn't a crate, it was a fish trap. When we went fishing in Wisconsin, using a fish trap carried a $5 fine. "Grandma," I said, "is trapping fish legal in the state?" "If it was," she said, "we wouldn't have to be so quiet." "What's a fine?" "Nothing if you don't get caught," she said. "Anyhow, it's not my boat," which was an example of the way Grandma reasoned. "Them critters love that cheese," she said fondly, as the trap sank from view. She bent over the side to try to wash the smell off her hands, nearly swamping the boat. Soon we were gliding gently downstream, Grandma rowing easy. The catfish were at her feet, flopping less now. My brain buzzed. Dad was a dedicated fisherman. He tied his own flies. He was a member of the Conservation Club. What if he knew that his own mother ran an illegal fish trap? Brewing home beer was one thing, because the prohibition law only profited the bootleggers. But we're talking about good sportsmanship here. I noticed Mary Alice's eyes on me. She was watching me around Grandma's rowing arm, and she was reading my mind. This was when we decided never to tell Dad. You could say one thing for Grandma's method. You got all your fishing done at once. How do you like that, Caesar and Tristan? It wasn't later than 8 o'clock, and maybe we'd gotten away with it. It seemed to me we ought to have brought some poles along, and a can of worms, considering our catch. But I thought maybe things would settle down now, and we could have the quiet day in the country Grandma wanted. Then we heard singing. I almost jumped out of the boat. It had felt as if we three were all alone in the world. Now the singing warbled up from behind a bend in the creek. like a bad barbershop quartet with extra voices chiming in. Can't town ladies sing this song, doo-dah, doo-dah. Grandma nudged the boat back into the bank, just where the creek began to bend. Through the undergrowth, we saw a ramshackle building on the far bank. Above the porch was a sign. A plank with words burned in read, Rod and Gun Club. A row of empty whiskey bottles stood on the porch rail, and from behind them came the singing. Bet my money on the bobtailed nag, somebody bet on the bay. The porch sagged with singers, grown men in their underwear, still partying from last night, old guys in real droopy underwear. It was a grisly sight, and Mary Alice's eyes bugged. I wasn't sure she ought to be seeing this. They were waving bottles and trying to dance. I didn't know what they'd do next. Grandma was fascinated. As we watched, a skinny old guy with a deputy's badge pinned on his long johns stepped forth and was real sick over the edge of the rail in the water. Earl T. Askew, Grandma muttered, president of the Chamber of Commerce. But now a fat old geezer in the droopiest drawers and nothing else pulled himself up on the porch rail. Bottles toppled into the water as he stood barefoot on the rail, teetering back and forth, while the others behind him roared, Whoa, whoa, shut up a minute, he roared back at them, and I'll sing you a good song. He took a slug out of the bottle in his fist and began. The night that Patty Murphy died, I never shall forget. The whole darn town got stinkin' drunk, and some ain't sober yet. The only thing they done that night that filled my heart with fear, they took the ice right off the corpse and put it in the beer. Then he fell back into the arms of the cheering crowd. Ain't that disgusting, Grandma said. He couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. I wonder if she really thinks it's disgusting or not. Who is he? I whispered. O.B. Dickerson, the sheriff, she said. And them drunk skunks with him is the entire business community of the town. Mary Alice gasped. The drawers on some of the business community were writing mighty low. They're not acting right, she said very prim. Men in a bunch never do, Grandma said. They were tight enough to fight, too, and we were on their private property. Not only that, we were in a boat full of trapped fish, almost under the bloodshot eye of the sheriff. I thought it was time to head upstream as fast as Grandma could row. But no, she jammed an oar into the bank to push us off, then she began rowing around the bend. My heart stopped. The full chorus was singing again, louder as we got nearer. Sweet Adeline, old pal of mine. The Rod and Gun Club came into view, and so did we. Mary Alice was perched in the bow. Grandma was rowing steady, and I was in the stern, wondering if the fish showed. It took the drunks on the porch a moment to focus on us. We were sailing right past them now, smooth as silk, big as life. They saw us, and Grandma saw them, as if for the first time. I'm sure she's known that they're there because she's gone fishing here before. She seemed to lose control of the oars, and her mouth fell open in shock. She's faking it. Mary Alice was already shocked and didn't have to pretend. I didn't know where to look. Some of the business community were so far gone they just stared back, unbelieving. They thought they owned this stretch of creek. A few, seeing that Grandma and Mary Alice were of the opposite gender, scrambled to hide themselves behind the others. But you never saw anybody looking as scandalized as Grandma was at these old birds in their union suits and less. She was speechless as her gaze passed over them all, recognizing everybody. It's a small town. Everybody knows everybody, like Gooding. It was a silent scene until Sheriff O.B. Dickerson found his voice. Stop in the name of the law, he bellowed. That's my boat. So she stole the sheriff's boat. Before the Rod and Gun Club was out of sight, Grandma had regained control of the oars. She rowed on as if none of this had ever happened. The sun was beating down, so she didn't push herself. After all, the sheriff couldn't chase us downstream. We were in his boat. Another bend and the flock of turtles sunning on the stumps. Grandma pulled up for the remains of an old dock. We tied up there, and now we were out of the boat, climbing up a bluff. Grandma led, dragging the net of catfish. I was in the rear, doing my best with the picnic camper. Mary Alice was between us, watching where she walked. She was scareder of snakes than she let on, if you ask me. An old house without a speck of paint on it stood tall on the bluff. Its outbuildings had caved in, and the privy stood at an angle. There were still prairie chickens running around in those days, and they were pecking dirt. Otherwise, the place looked lifeless. Rags hung at the windows. The porch overlooking the creek had fallen off. Grandma tramped around to the far side of the house. She dropped her fish on the ground and waved us inside. Even in full daylight, the place looked haunted. I didn't want to go in, but Mary Alice was marching through the door already, so I had to. Is anybody inside? I whispered to Grandma as I lugged the hamper past her. Nobody but Aunt Puss Chapman, she said, like anybody would know that. It had been a fine house once. A wide, black walnut staircase rose to a landing window, with most of it stained glass still in. But it was creepy in here, dim and dusty. Smelled funny, too. We went into a room piled up with furniture. Then one of the chairs spoke. "Where you been, girl?" Mary Alice flinched, but the old woman lost in the chair was staring straight at Grandma. And calling her girl? She was by many years the oldest person we'd ever seen up till then. Bald as an egg, but she needed a shave, and not a tooth in her head. "Who's them children with you?" she demanded of Grandma. "Just kids I found round the crick bank," Grandma said to our surprise. "They was fishin'." "I don't know as I want them in the house." Aunt Puss Chapman sent us a mean look. "Do they steal?" "Nothing you've got," Grandma said under her breath. "Talk up, girl," Aunt Puss said. "You mumble. I've spoken to you about that before." She pulled her shawl closer, though it was the hottest day of the year. "I'm a-hungry. You hightailed it out of here after breakfast, and I ain't seen hide nor hoof mark of you since." "She ain't seen me for a week," Grandma mumbled to us, but she forgets. Then she called out to Aunt Puss. "Catfish and fried potatoes and onions, vinegar slaw and pickled peach apiece, and some of the same for your supper." "I suppose it beats starvin'," Aunt Puss snapped, "but hop to it, girl, stir your stumps." I thought I might faint. Nobody could talk to Grandma like that and live. She led us back to an old-time kitchen. It was in real bad shape, but well-stocked. Big sacks of potatoes and onions, cornmeal, things in cans, and we'd brought a full hamper to add to Aunt Puss's larder. A larder is where you keep all of your dry goods. I had to fire up the stove with a bunch of kindling while Grandma and Mary Alice went to work on the potatoes and onions. Mary Alice was in as big a daze as I was. "Grandma, is that nasty old lady your aunt?" I stopped to listen. If she was, that made her our great-great-aunt. "Nah, I was hired girl to her before I was married," Grandma said. "Lived in this house and fetched and carried for her and slept in the attic." "You had a room in the attic?" "Nah, I just slept there. Had a bed tick with straw on it and changed it every spring. Haven't always lived in the luxury you see me in now." "But did she pay you, Grandma?" "Pay? She didn't pay me a plug nickel, but she fed me." I thought about that. "And now you feed her," I said, but Grandma didn't reply. We cleaned the fish on the plank table outdoors. I didn't care much for it. It made me kind of sick to hear Grandma rip the skin off the catfish. She had her own quick way of doing that, but every time it sounded like the fish screamed. And she put me in charge of chopping off their heads, but I didn't like chopping off the head of anything looking back at me. And the catfish have mustaches, for some reason, which is just plain weird. Finally, Mary Alice took the rusty hatchet out of my hand, and whomp, she'd bring down the blade, and that fish head would go flying. Mary Alice was good at it, so I let her do it. Grandma gutted. It was afternoon before we sat down at the dining room table under a cobweb gasolier. Aunt Puss was already at her place, so she was sprier than she looked. Grandma settled at the foot of the table without her hat. Her white hair hung in damp tendrils. We'd been working like a whole pack of bird dogs. Another simile. Watching Aunt Puss gum catfish was not a pretty sight. "These fish taste muddy," she observed. "You uns catch 'em?" "Yes," I said. "No," Mary Alice said. "What did you use for bait?" Aunt Puss said, looking at both of us. "Cheese," I said. "Worms," Mary Alice said more wisely. Joey is not a very good liar, is he? Since we couldn't get together on our story, Aunt Puss changed the subject. "You children still in school?" We nodded. "Do they whup you?" "Do they what?" Mary Alice said. "Do they paddle your behind when you need it?" Aunt Puss looked interested. "If they did, I'd quit school," Mary Alice said, who'd just completed 3rd grade. "They'd whup that girl raw." Aunt Puss pointed down a fork at the table at Grandma. I had a sudden thought. Aunt Puss thought Grandma and Mary Alice and I were all about the same age. She hadn't noticed the years passing. That's why Grandma didn't say we were her grandkids. It would have just mixed up Aunt Puss. "That's when she come to work for me. They throwed her out of school." Aunt Puss peered down the table. "Tell 'em why." We looked at Grandma, naturally interested to know why she'd been thrown out of school. Grandma waved us away. I forget, she said. I don't, Aunt Puss waved a fork. It was because you wadded up your underdrawers to stop up the flue in the stove and smoke out the schoolhouse. That was the end of your education. Working for you was an education, Grandma muttered, though only Mary Alice and I heard. It took us under another hour to clean up the kitchen the way Grandma wanted to leave it. When it was time for us to go, Aunt Puss was back in her chair in the parlor. "Where do you think you're off to now?" she called out as we trooped through the front hall. "Down to the sty to slop the hogs," Grandma called back. "Well, don't dawdle. You dawdle, and I've spoken to you about that before. Get on out of here," Aunt Puss hollered. "Let the door hit you where the dog bit you." Outdoors, I said, "Does she have hogs?" "Used to," Grandma said. "She was right well off at one time. She's poor now, but she don't know it." "How could she? She still had her hired girl and plenty to eat." "You take her food every week, don't you, Grandma?" "Generally a good big roast chicken. She can gum that for days." Grandma turned down the lane. "Keeps her out of the poor farm, and it gives me a quiet day in the country. That's a fair swap." Then her jaw clenched in its way. "But it's just private business between her and me, and I don't tell my private business." We walked country roads all the way home. Grandma set a brisk pace, and I struggled along behind with a hamper. Heaved and cleaned catfish. Mary Alice went in the middle, watching where she walked. By the time we got home, the trees in Grandma's yard were throwing long shadows, and it was evening in her kitchen. Mary Alice and I were both staggering. I was ready to go straight to bed. But Grandma said, "Skin down to the cellar and bring up 15 or 20 bottles of my beer. Just carry 2 at a time. I don't want any broke." I whimpered. But she was turning on Mary Alice, and "Yous and me's gonna fry up a couple pecks of potatoes to go with these fish. There won't be nothing to it. I'll peel the potatoes this morning before you two was up." We stared. The catfish fried in long pans with the potatoes and onions at the other end popping in the grease. The kitchen was blue with smoke, and night was at the windows before we finished up. "Now get down every platter I own," she said. Then she sent me toward the card table I'd used as my jigsaw puzzle for Charles A. Lindbergh. Following her lead, we carried everything out into the night, making many trips. Wonder what they're doing. Why would they carry all that catfish outside? We lugged it across the road and up the Wabash Railroad right at right-of-way and planted the card table in the gravel. Finally, the platters of fish and potatoes overlapped on the table, and the open beer bottles stood in a row beside the tracks. As the drifters came along, being hounded out of town, Grandma gave them a good feed and a beer to wet their whistles. Mary Alice helped in an apron of Grandma's that dragged on the ground. They were hollow-eyed men who couldn't believe their luck. 2 or 3 of them, 5 or 6, then a bunch, standing around the table, eating with both hands, sharing out the beer. They didn't say much. They didn't thank her. She wasn't looking for thanks. She'd taken off her overalls and put on the same washed dress back on, but she'd tied a fresh apron over it. Her hair was a mess, fanning out from the bun at the back, white in the moonlight. She watched them feed, working her mouth. Then we saw the swinging lanterns, the sheriff and his deputies coming along behind to keep the drifters moving. Up trooped O.B. Dickerson, dressed now with his badge on and his full belt of bullets riding low under his belly. His deputies loomed behind him, but they weren't singing Sweet Adeline. Okay, break it up," he said, elbowing through the drifters. Then he came to Grandma. "Dag and nabbit, Mrs. Dowdle, you're everywhere I turn. You're all over me like white on rice." Another simile. "Now what do you think you're doing?" "Giving these boys the first eats they've had today." "Or yesterday," a drifter said. "Mrs. Dowdle, let me explain something to you," the sheriff bawled. "We don't want to feed these loafers. We want them out of town." "They are out of town." Grandma pointed her spatula at the sheriff's feet. "The town stops there. We're in the country." "Yes, and I'm the sheriff of the country." O.B. Dickerson bellowed. "You're in my jurisdiction." "Do tell," Grandma said. "Run me in." The minute she said that, all the drifters looked up. That was when Sheriff Dickerson deputies saw they were outnumbered. "Mrs. Dowdle," the sheriff boomed, "I wouldn't know what to charge you with first. You're a one-woman crime wave. Where'd you get them fish, for instance?" he said, wisely overlooking the home brews in the drifters' hands. "Out of the same trap in Salt Creek," Grandma remarked. "Same as one as you get yours." O.B. Dickerson's eyes bulged. You accusing me, the sheriff of Piatt County, of running fish traps? He poked his own chest with a pudgy finger. Not this morning, Grandma replied. You was too drunk. The drifters chuckled. And talking about this morning, the sheriff said, his face shading purple even in the darkness. You stole my boat. That's what we call larceny, Mrs. Dowdle. You could go up for that. Oh, well, the boat. Grandma made a little gesture with the spatula. You'll find it tied up at Aunt Puss Chapman's dock. As a rule, I take it back where you tied up, but of course I couldn't do that this morning. How could I row these grandkids of mine back past the Rod and Gun Club? They'd already seen what no child should. The sheriff and his deputies, blind, drunk, and naked as jaybirds, dancing jigs on the porch. Well, they had their underdrawers on. And I don't know what all. It's like to have marked this girl for life. Grandma nudged Mary Alice, who stood there in the big apron looking drooped and damaged. I'm thinking about taking her to the doctor so she can talk it out. I don't want her to develop one of them complexes you hear about. Whoa, the deputies murmured behind Sheriff Dickerson. Earl T. Askew stepped up and said into the ear, Obie, let's just let sleeping dogs lay. I got my hands full with Miss Askew as it is. The sheriff simmered but said, Okay, Earl, if you say so. The sheriff and his posse were in retreat now, but he had to cover himself. Mrs. Dowdle, he said, pulling a long face, they's things I can overlook. But it seems to me you're running a soup kitchen without a license from the Board of Health. I have an idea there's a law against that on the books. Go look it up, Obie, Grandma said. See if there's a law against feeding the hungry. But I have to tell you, you've talked so long, the evidence is all ate up. And, of course, it was. The drifters had wolfed down the last morsel. With a small finger, Mary Alice pointed out the bare platters. Only a faint scent of fried catfish lingered on the night air. The empty beer bottles went without saying. The drifters were moving off down the track, and the deputies were heading back into town. Obie Dickerson spit in the gravel, swung around and followed them, his big boots grinding gravel. We stacked the platters and rounded up the beer bottles for Grandma's next batch. I collapsed the legs on the card table. There wasn't a lot of music in Grandma, but she was humming as we worked, and I thought I recognized the tune. The night that Patty Murphy died, I never shall forget. Then, after a quiet day in the country, we carried everything back across the road under a silver dollar moon. All right. That was a good chapter. No? I hope that you guys are all reading your 20 minutes every night. Every day. And don't forget, you have 3 reading responses to be doing daily as well. So don't forget those. I haven't gotten many from people yesterday, so don't forget that today. Tomorrow we have the chapter 1932, The Day of Judgment.